Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. Eleanor had never been the kind of woman who drew attention with noise. She moved with quiet poise, spoke with intention, and carried an aura that made people lean in, not because she demanded their gaze, but because she invited reflection. Her presence felt like the calm after a storm, soothing, unthreatening yet profound. She grew up in Belaka, a small community nestled at the edge of Edenton, where her parents ran a modest flower shop that always smelled of marigold and mint. Her world was centered in softness, shaped by kindness, and colored in the gentle rhythm of early morning routines and quiet evening prayers. She believed love was something you nurtured like a seed in the garden, something that needed time, patience, and faith. So when she met Nathaniel Moore, a charismatic business consultant with a polished smile and promises tied in neat sentences, it felt like her quiet garden had finally attracted the sun. He was everything her friends told her to look for: ambitious, well-spoken, family-oriented, and established in Edenton's thriving professional scene. And yet it wasn't just his charm or tailored suits that drew her in. It was the way he asked about her parents, complimented her laugh, and held her hand in ways that felt both protective and intentional. She didn't know it yet, but love, as it would unfold for her, had its own shape, one that didn't always look like a garden in bloom. Their courtship felt like a well-scripted romance, like something out of the pages of an old-fashioned love story, where handwritten letters were replaced with thoughtful texts and dinners were less about food and more about unspoken emotions passing between glances. Nathaniel often took her to lakeside cafes just outside Edenton, where the view melted into the water and time seemed to pause for them. He asked about her childhood dreams and promised that he would always support her ambitions, no matter what they were. He spoke often about his mother, Patricia Moore, a woman he called his first queen. Eleanor admired how fondly he talked about her. In her mind, a man who loved his mother that deeply would surely know how to treat a wife. What she didn't notice at the time were the subtle hesitations, the way his opinions often paused mid-sentence when Patricia's name came up, as though he was mentally checking if she would approve of what he was about to say. Eleanor didn't count those as red flags. They felt more like signs of a man deeply grounded in his family. When Nathaniel told her he had mentioned her to his mother and that Patricia wasn't sure yet, she smiled politely and told me it would take time. Love, after all, needed space to grow, and Eleanor believed if she just showed Patricia who she really was, she too would come around. By the time Nathaniel proposed, Eleanor had already begun adjusting herself in tiny ways that seemed harmless then. She wore pastel colors because Patricia thought bold tones were for loud women. She baked more than she cooked because Nathaniel once mentioned that his mother preferred desserts over savory dishes. She changed her perfume after Patricia said her old scent was too heavy. It was not submission, Eleanor thought, it was compromise, the kind all women made when love was involved. The proposal happened on a Sunday afternoon in front of both families at a small gathering in a garden filled with white roses and buttercups. Patricia's face, though painted with a smile, betrayed a twinge of discomfort. She clapped when Eleanor said yes, but her eyes remained cold, unmoved. Afterwards, she told Eleanor in a quiet tone, "You're a polite girl. I hope you stay that way." It wasn't a compliment, it was a warning dressed as approval. Nathaniel didn't notice, or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. Either way, Eleanor didn't bring it up. She had already begun learning the dance of silence, a rhythm many women mastered long before they realized they were dancing at all. Their wedding was grand, orchestrated down to the final detail by Patricia, who insisted she had a better eye for elegance. The venue was a stately hall in Edenton's oldest district, where chandeliers sparkled like fallen stars and the marble floors whispered luxury. Eleanor had dreamt of something simpler, an intimate ceremony in her parents' garden, but her wishes had been neatly folded and tucked away the moment Patricia offered to handle everything. Even her wedding gown wasn't truly hers. Patricia took her shopping and dismissed every dress Eleanor liked, until she settled for one Patricia chose, a sleek satin design that hugged her body in a way that felt unfamiliar, like wearing someone else's skin. On the wedding day, as Eleanor walked down the aisle, she looked radiant but felt hollow. Her father squeezed her hand and whispered, "You look like your mother on our wedding day." But even that sweetness couldn't fill the quiet ache in her chest. When Nathaniel took her hand at the altar, he turned first toward his mother, seeking a nod that came too late and too stiff. Eleanor saw it, saw the way Nathaniel's shoulders relaxed only after his mother's approval flickered across her face. And for the first time, Eleanor wondered if she'd married a man or a mirror reflecting his mother's desires. But the vows had been said, and the music swelled, and everyone cheered, not knowing that beneath the surface of this celebration, something fragile had already begun to crack. The house Nathaniel brought Eleanor to after their wedding was every bit as elegant as the neighborhood brochures promised. Nestled along the flower-lined bends of Elmstone Avenue in Edenton's affluent district, the property stood like a painting brought to life, arched windows with bronze trimming, a manicured lawn always humming with bees, and marble floors so pristine they seemed untouched by the world. Yet, from the moment Eleanor stepped into the foyer, something felt arranged. The furniture chosen by Patricia as a wedding gift bore no trace of Eleanor's taste: floral-patterned armchairs with stiff upholstery, gilded picture frames of Nathaniel and Patricia from various family events, and curtains so heavy they swallowed the daylight. Eleanor wandered from room to room on that first afternoon alone, gently brushing her fingertips across the furniture as though trying to feel her way into the space. In the bedroom, she paused at the vanity and stared at her reflection, wondering if this life was truly hers or a role she'd been cast into. The walls were silent, offering no answers, only the faint tick of the antique clock Patricia had insisted they hang in the hallway, a ticking reminder of whose voice still echoed in every corner of their new home. Patricia's visits began subtly, always announced as short check-ins that somehow stretched into hours. She'd sweep in with a Tupperware of stew she claimed Eleanor needed, because you must be tired trying to be a wife, then proceed to critique everything from the scent of the soap in the guest bathroom to how Eleanor arranged books on the coffee table. Eleanor smiled through each jab, told herself this was normal. Newlyweds dealt with overbearing in-laws all the time. But it was the way Patricia claimed space that slowly began to squeeze Eleanor out. She would sit in Eleanor's favorite armchair during afternoon tea and flip through the newspaper, humming judgmentally when Eleanor spoke about her plans to reopen her design studio. "Why don't you wait until you have children?" Patricia would suggest, always in that tone, more command than advice. Nathaniel never intervened. He'd laugh off his mother's remarks and say, "That's just mum being mum." He didn't see the way Eleanor's shoulders tightened when Patricia entered the room. He didn't notice how her smiles dimmed with each visit. He only saw peace when Eleanor chose silence, and so silence became her refuge, even though it left her choking on everything she wanted to say. Over time, Eleanor began shrinking, not in stature but in spirit. Her voice, once full of softness and insight, became measured and hesitant. She stopped sharing her ideas for the business she'd once dreamed of launching. Her sketchbooks, once scattered joyfully across the dining table, now stayed buried in a drawer, untouched and forgotten. She tried different things to win Patricia's approval. Recipes from the old family cookbook, floral centerpieces she thought might impress her, even dressing in more conservative colors when she knew Patricia was coming over. But nothing seemed to make a dent in the older woman's contempt. It was as if Patricia had drawn a line in the sand the moment Nathaniel said, "I do," and Eleanor had unknowingly stepped over it. Even in the smallest things, Eleanor found herself being corrected. Once she served Patricia tea in a delicate porcelain cup, a wedding gift from her aunt, and Patricia refused to drink from it, stating that glassware, not porcelain, is for serious women. Nathaniel laughed, shrugged, and switched his mother's cup without a word. That night, Eleanor stood in the kitchen long after everyone had gone to bed, her hands gripping the counter, tears soaking into the sleeves of her robe. She wasn't even sure what she was mourning, her voice, her dignity, or the quiet realization that she might never be allowed to belong in her own home. The emotional distance between Eleanor and Nathaniel deepened slowly, not through explosive arguments, but through the absence of acknowledgement. When she voiced small concerns, Nathaniel would brush them away with a distracted kiss or a sigh that suggested impatience. He had begun to treat her like a fragile instrument he didn't know how to tune, best left untouched for fear of ruining it. He still brought her flowers on weekends, but they felt like gestures of habit, not love. When they went out for dinners, he always invited Patricia along. Eleanor had once tried to request a quiet evening for just the two of them, but Nathaniel had replied, "Mum would feel hurt. You know how she gets." So Eleanor stopped asking. In public, they still looked like the perfect couple, Eleanor in her graceful dresses, Nathaniel with his hand resting possessively on her back. But behind closed doors, they lived like actors in a play that had lost its script. One morning, Eleanor found herself whispering apologies to herself while brushing her teeth, as though preparing for another day of pretending. It was during one of those long silences, while sipping lukewarm tea at the kitchen island, that she realized something important. She was living in a house built for a woman she could never be. And in trying to please everyone, she had become invisible to the one person she had once believed would always see her. The engagement party for Nathaniel's cousin was set in the expansive garden of the Marshall Estate, a well-known venue in Edenton that whispered old wealth with every rose bush and glimmering champagne flute. The crowd buzzed with a mix of polite laughter, quiet gossip, and soft jazz playing from a live trio tucked beneath an arched trellis. Eleanor arrived on Nathaniel's arm, dressed in a peach-colored gown that caught the fading sunlight and danced with every movement. She had chosen the dress with care, hoping it would reflect warmth and dignity. Yet from the moment they stepped into the crowd, she felt Patricia's disapproving eyes slice through her like glass. The older woman stood by the poolside, flanked by two other wives, her voice loud enough to be heard despite the gentle music. "She's so bright today, trying too hard to be noticed perhaps." Eleanor pretended not to hear, clutching her clutch tighter. She smiled at people she recognized, exchanged pleasantries, and kept close to Nathaniel, hoping for some sense of protection from the humiliating undercurrents she knew too well by now. But Nathaniel, dressed in a charcoal blazer and polished shoes, drifted from conversation to conversation, often leaving her at the edge of circles where she barely felt welcome. The real blow came later in the evening, when the speeches had begun and the crowd was hushed beneath strings of fairy lights. Eleanor had been called to join the toast as the newest addition to the Moore family, a gesture orchestrated by one of Nathaniel's cousins who genuinely liked her. As she stepped forward, glass in hand, Patricia interrupted with a high-pitched laugh and a loud, "Oh, let her sit. She's not quite ready to speak for the family yet." The crowd erupted in scattered, uncomfortable chuckles. Eleanor paused mid-step, the heat rising to her face so quickly it felt like she had stepped into fire. She opened her mouth, unsure whether to smile through it or assert herself. But before a word could form, Nathaniel turned sharply, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You dare not talk back at my mother," he snapped, his expression fierce not with defense but with warning. The silence that followed was heavier than the humid air. A few people looked away. Others stared at Eleanor with pity or awkward curiosity, and some simply turned their attention back to their glasses, eager to forget the moment ever happened. Eleanor blinked once, then twice, and quietly lowered her glass, turning to retreat into the crowd without a word. The remainder of the evening blurred in a haze of clenched teeth and brittle small talk. Eleanor kept her movements minimal, seated near the edge of the tent, watching people dance and sway under golden lights as if nothing had happened. Nathaniel, as though nothing had fractured, returned to socializing with practiced ease, laughing too loudly, patting shoulders, and indulging in nostalgic family stories. Every once in a while he'd glance toward Eleanor, not with concern, but with a look that suggested he hoped she wouldn't embarrass him further. Patricia, emboldened by her son's public defense, floated through the party like a queen who just won a battle. She made a show of kissing babies and complimenting women on their earrings, while Eleanor sat silently, a porcelain figure cracked at the base but still upright. Someone offered her a drink, but her throat felt too tight to swallow anything. The music grew louder, the laughter wilder, and the clinking of cutlery and crystal seemed to mock her stillness. She felt invisible and exposed at the same time, like a painting hung in the wrong gallery, watched only for how out of place it looked. Her dress, which she had once loved, now clung to her skin like a costume she couldn't peel off. She stared at the wine in her glass, unmoving, as if holding herself still enough could make her disappear. When the party finally began to thin out and the crowd trickled toward their cars, Eleanor waited by the fountain near the driveway, the moonlight casting a pale shimmer across the surface of the water. Nathaniel stayed behind with the last group of cousins, engaged in loud nostalgic banter. He didn't once approach her to apologize, explain, or even acknowledge the sting of what had transpired. When their car finally pulled up, she slid into the passenger seat wordlessly. The silence in the vehicle was absolute. No music, no conversation, not even the hum of the air conditioner. Eleanor stared out the window, the night passing in shadows and streetlights. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers twisted into each other, nails digging slightly into her palm. She felt cold and heavy, not just with embarrassment, but with a bitter truth she had been too afraid to name until now. She was married to a man whose loyalty belonged to someone else, and no amount of dignity, grace, or silence would ever earn her a seat at the table that Patricia had long ago claimed as her own. That night when they got home, Nathaniel went straight to bed without a word. Eleanor remained seated in the living room, the soft ticking of the wall clock measuring every beat of her disappointment. The days after the party moved with a strange weight, as though the house had absorbed Eleanor's humiliation and now carried it in the walls. Everything felt more silent, more calculated, more cold. The mornings came like fog, slow, muted, unwelcome. She would wake up beside Nathaniel, who remained wrapped in his own indifference, and the sound of his even breath would fill the room like an accusation. Sometimes he would get up and go about his routine without so much as a glance in her direction. Other times he would kiss her forehead absently, as if touching a piece of furniture out of habit. Eleanor stopped waiting for him to see her. Instead, she filled her time with rituals, folding napkins to perfection, scrubbing the kitchen sink until it gleamed, reorganizing the spices alphabetically, though she barely cooked anymore. It wasn't about the housework, it was about control. If everything was in its place, then maybe she wouldn't feel so utterly out of place. She began moving through her days like a ghost dressed in silk, present but fading. The mirror in the hallway stopped being her friend. She avoided catching her own eyes, afraid of seeing the woman staring back, afraid of realizing how far she had drifted from the person she once knew. Patricia's presence became more frequent, and with each visit she pushed further into Eleanor's life. She no longer asked before rearranging the living room cushions or commenting on the temperature of the tea. She spoke over Eleanor during conversations and corrected her stories in front of guests. At first, Eleanor tried to keep her voice even, tried to maintain the image of the composed wife. But inside her spirit thinned, stretched too tightly across too many days of swallowing her voice. One afternoon, as she sat quietly while Patricia criticized the way she had handled a dinner invitation, Eleanor felt something inside her shift, not a loud cracking but a soft unraveling. Her hands, folded on her lap, trembled slightly, but she said nothing. She just nodded, her lips pressed together like a stitched wound. Nathaniel walked into the room midway through the scolding and didn't ask what was happening. He only poured himself a drink and chuckled at something his mother said about young wives and their modern laziness. Eleanor watched him sip his wine and smile, as though she was a chair or a vase, something to decorate the room, not inhabit it. That night, she stood in the hallway long after everyone had gone to bed, staring at the family portrait on the wall, the one Patricia had insisted on taking. Her smile in the photo looked borrowed, and for the first time, she wondered how long a person could pretend before they stopped recognizing their own face. The isolation took root quietly. Eleanor stopped answering phone calls from her friends, not because she didn't want to talk, but because she no longer knew what to say. How do you explain the kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being constantly unseen? Her phone buzzed with unanswered texts. "Miss you, Elle. Let's have lunch. You okay?" Each one a tiny reminder of the life she wants. But shame, unspoken as it was, can be a powerful silencer. She didn't want to admit she had built her dreams on a foundation that now felt like sand. Even her parents noticed the change. Her mother once asked over the phone, "Are you happy, sweetheart?" And Eleanor had paused, the silence too long, too loud. She'd mumbled something vague about being busy and ended the call early. She didn't want her mother to hear the cracks in her voice, didn't want to explain that her home was a palace with invisible bars. She started journaling again, only this time the pages weren't filled with dreams or ideas. They were filled with letters she would never send. Letters to Nathaniel, to herself, to the girl she used to be. She wrote things like, "I miss the sound of my own laughter," and "What does love look like when it doesn't have to ask for permission?" The words poured out at night beneath dim bedside lamps while Nathaniel snored beside her, unaware that the woman he once courted with poetry was quietly bleeding her truth onto paper he would never read. The breaking point didn't come in fire or fury, it came in silence. Eleanor had gone into the kitchen one evening to prepare a cup of tea, something she still did out of ritual even when she had no appetite. She had been feeling dizzy all day, her vision hazy around the edges, her limbs heavy with fatigue. She reached for the kettle, then paused, swaying slightly. Her hand trembled as she tried to steady herself against the counter, but the floor seemed to tip beneath her feet. The next thing she remembered was waking up on the cold tiles, the overhead light buzzing faintly, her cheek pressed against the linoleum. Nathaniel's voice called her name from the hallway once, twice, but it lacked urgency. When he found her, he frowned, not with concern but with inconvenience. "You should eat more," he muttered, helping her up like one might lift a bag of groceries that had tipped over. Patricia, who had arrived moments later, took one look and said, "A strong woman never lets herself fall apart." Eleanor nodded quietly, cradling her aching head as though agreeing with the law of nature. No one asked how she felt, no one asked what she needed. They simply returned to the living room, where the television murmured softly, and laughter drifted from a show no one was truly watching. That night Eleanor stood beneath the shower, fully clothed, letting the water soak through her blouse and into her skin, not caring about the chill. She pressed her palms against the tiled wall and whispered, "I'm still here," not to anyone in particular, but to herself because someone had to remember. Eleanor's withdrawal didn't announce itself with a loud rebellion or a confrontation. It arrived in the form of detachment so subtle it almost escaped notice. She began to unthread herself from conversations, choosing nods over responses, silence over argument. She still set the table, still greeted Nathaniel when he returned from work, but there was a hollowness to her presence, like a frame without a picture. He didn't comment on it, at least not in the beginning. He was used to her gentleness, her passivity, her absence of resistance. But something was changing beneath her skin, slowly but certainly. She no longer corrected him when he got details wrong about her life. She no longer explained herself when he questioned her decisions. Instead, she watched him with a stillness that unsettled even him at times, though he couldn't place why. Patricia began to notice first. "You're not as cheerful as you used to be," she remarked one afternoon while browsing through the refrigerator. "It doesn't look good when a wife walks around with a funeral face." Eleanor didn't respond. She stood by the kitchen window, staring at the birds pecking at the soil in the garden bed. She wasn't trying to make a statement. She was simply exhausted, tired of explaining, tired of adjusting, tired of pouring herself into a cup that had no bottom. That silence grew legs. It began walking with her through every room, trailing behind her like a second shadow. Even the staff noticed, though they said nothing. There was just a slight shift in the way the air moved around her, as though the house itself had begun to hold its breath. Patricia, however, mistook Eleanor's quiet for weakness, a misunderstanding that would prove costly. She began inserting herself deeper into Eleanor's space, offering unsolicited advice about fertility, hinting at her disappointment that no child had yet come, and once even suggesting that some women's wombs stay shut until they learn humility. The insult was disguised as tradition, of course, delivered with the soft tone of someone speaking for your own good. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply looked at Patricia and smiled, a quiet, unbothered smile that didn't reach her eyes. That was when Patricia grew nervous. She preferred Eleanor the way she had been, compliant, eager to please, desperate for validation. This new version, who moved without seeking permission, was unnerving. She told Nathaniel, "Your wife is losing her way," and Nathaniel, distracted with work and increasingly irritable at home, passed the comment off as unnecessary drama. But in truth, even he could sense it. He began to notice the way Eleanor no longer looked at him with expectation. She didn't ask when he would be home. She no longer offered to pack his lunch or remind him to wear a jacket on cold mornings. It wasn't resentment, at least not the loud kind. It's the absence of need, and that absence was more jarring than any argument could have been. Still, he said nothing. Men like Nathaniel, raised to believe silence from a woman was the reward of obedience, did not know how to decipher when silence became something else entirely, withdrawal. Then came the Moore anniversary party, a yearly gathering of status and spectacle that Patricia used to measure her relevance in Edenton's social circles. The estate was decorated in soft golds and crystal chandeliers, guests arriving in glittering gowns and designer tuxedos, greeted with flute after flute of chilled champagne. Eleanor arrived with Nathaniel, but did not wear the dress Patricia had chosen for her. Instead, she wore a sleek black gown with a plunging neckline and open back, elegant, tasteful, but undeniably assertive. Her hair was pulled back into a low chignon, her lips painted a muted wine red. She walked into the room not like someone seeking approval, but like someone who had stopped asking for it. The murmur of compliments followed her across the room, some genuine, others laced with surprise. Nathaniel barely looked at her when she entered. He was too distracted talking to Olivia, the young lawyer Patricia had introduced to him a few months prior, just for networking. Eleanor had noticed the chemistry between them, though neither had admitted to it outright. She had watched Olivia laugh too loudly at Nathaniel's dry jokes, had caught the flicker of something unspoken in Patricia's approving nods whenever Olivia was around. Eleanor had never confronted Nathaniel about it. She didn't need to. Some betrayals didn't require proof. They just settled quietly into the soul like dust, coating everything you once trusted with a thin layer of disbelief. That night, Eleanor gave a toast. She hadn't planned to, but as conversations dimmed and glasses clinked, one of the guests handed her the microphone with a smile, prompting her to speak as the woman who keeps Nathaniel grounded. She rose slowly, her expression calm, her fingers light on the stem of her glass. Patricia stiffened beside her, and Nathaniel looked up from across the room, his eyes narrowing slightly. Eleanor looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some judgmental, all waiting for the performance they assumed she'd give. She cleared her throat gently. "I'd like to thank everyone for being here tonight," she began, her voice poised but steady. "I've learned that marriages are not always what they seem on the outside. Sometimes what looks like partnership is really just quiet survival. And what we call love is sometimes just a habit of wearing a mask." A subtle murmur moved through the crowd. She didn't cry, she didn't accuse me. She simply raised her glass, to peace wherever we find it. Then she handed the microphone back and walked out. She didn't wait for Nathaniel. She didn't look back. Her heels echoed softly against the marble as she exited the hall, the doors closing behind her with a calm finality that only those who have truly let go can understand. In the days following the anniversary party, the house took on a strange stillness. It wasn't the silence that comes from absence of sound, but the kind that emerges when something vital has left a space and nothing has returned to replace it. Eleanor's side of the closet remained untouched. Her slippers still sat neatly under bed, but her perfume no longer lingered in the air, and her toothbrush was no longer by the sink. Nathaniel noticed the details, though he didn't speak them aloud. He woke the next morning expecting her to be in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred her tea, or perhaps watering the succulents near the window like she used to. But she wasn't, and for a while he assumed it was temporary. Maybe she needed time. Maybe she was just trying to prove a point. But as the hours passed and the following night came and went without her return, a faint unease began to crawl beneath his skin. He searched the house, not frantically, but with the growing anxiety of someone who begins to realize they've taken something for granted and can no longer find it. Her suitcase was gone. A few of her favorite books were missing from the shelf. The room no longer smelled like lavender and rose water. He checked his phone, expecting a message, an explanation, even an accusation. But there was nothing, no texts, no missed calls. Just silence, the kind that pressed down on the walls and made even the air feel too thick to breathe. Patricia came over on the second day, confident that Eleanor was simply being melodramatic. "She's trying to draw attention to herself," she scoffed while sitting on the living room couch, rearranging throw pillows that were already in place. "She'll come back once she realizes no one is begging her to." But Nathaniel didn't respond. He sat across from her, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the untouched cup of coffee he had poured for Eleanor that morning out of habit. Patricia continued more sharply now. "I told you from the very beginning that she was too soft. Women like her crumble at the first sign of difficulty. But Nathaniel wasn't listening anymore. His mind wandered to small things, how Eleanor used to fold his shirts so precisely, how she always noticed when he'd had a hard day even when he didn't say a word, how she once stayed up all night to prepare a client proposal for him when his laptop crashed. He thought of the way she used to touch his arm lightly in public, just to let him know she was there. All these gestures, once so constant they had become invisible to him, now replayed in his mind with piercing clarity. He remembered how she had looked at the party, elegant, calm, otherworldly, like someone who had already said goodbye long before she stepped out of the room. Patricia's voice faded into the background. Her words no longer held their usual authority. For the first time, Nathaniel realized that his mother's dominance had never truly made him stronger. It had simply blinded him. By the end of the week, Nathaniel found the envelope. It was tucked inside one of Eleanor's cookbooks, the one she used most often. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably hers, neat, soft, and steady. Inside was a letter written not in anger but in clarity. It didn't rage, it didn't plead, it simply explained. She had written about how she had spent months trying to be seen, how she adjusted herself so many times that she no longer recognized who she was becoming. She described how exhausting it was to walk on eggshells in a house that never offered her comfort, how she waited day after day for someone to ask how she was truly doing. She spoke of the loneliness that came from loving someone who was only half present, and the humiliation of being reprimanded in public like a disobedient child. And then in the gentlest of words, she wrote something that made Nathaniel's breath catch in his chest. "I don't hate you. I just can't keep offering my love as proof of my worth. I won't compete with the woman who raised you, and I won't beg for the space I should have been given freely." He sat with the letter for hours, rereading every line until the ink imprinted itself into his thoughts. It wasn't just a goodbye. It was a declaration of liberation. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the full weight of what he had lost, not because she had left, but because he had driven her away piece by piece, word by word, silence by silence. The house, once alive with the quiet routines Eleanor had created, now felt cavernous. Every room echoed with absence. The kitchen, always warm with the smell of her evening tea, remained untouched. The guest towel stayed folded. The bookshelf, once reorganized weekly with gray care, gathered dust. Nathaniel tried to go about his days, but nothing fit right. He burned toast, forgot appointments, left lights on. Even Patricia seemed to fade from her usual role, unsure of how to fill the space Eleanor had left behind. On the 10th night, Nathaniel came home from work and sat in the living room without turning on the lights. He stared at the space where she used to sit and found himself wondering how he could have ever mistaken her silence for weakness. It had taken more strength than he could ever understand to endure what she had, and even more to finally walk away from it. He held the letter in his hand, folded now from repeated readings, the paper beginning to crease and wear at the edges. He placed it gently on the table beside him, like something sacred. No one called, no one visited, and when his phone did buzz, it was never her, not anymore. The woman who had once lit up the darkest corners of his life had left, not with fireworks, not with fury, but with grace so quiet it thundered in her absence. And now, in the echo of her departure, Nathaniel finally understood what he had lost. Not just a wife, but a woman who had loved him enough to stay far longer than she should have, and brave enough to leave when he gave her nothing to stay for. To the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.